Welcome to the Possibility Action Network podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton, aka Possibility Man. We're committed to bringing you guests who strive to better people's lives and serve as a force for good in the world. Our guest today, Jill Sitnick, is an author and educator with an advanced degree in instructional technology. Once she healed her childhood trauma with psychedelic therapy, she wrote her memoir, Rescuing Jill: How MDMA with a Dash of Mushrooms Heals My Childhood Trauma-Induced PTSD. Jill is now using her gifts as an educator to advocate for the use of psychedelics to heal trauma. Jill Sitnick, welcome to the show today.
Oh my goodness, Stephen, thank you. What a phenomenal intro. Can I just kind of like have you around all the time so you can intro me? That was great.
I appreciate that. Like, I'm excited to talk with you. But first, a reminder to our listeners and our viewers, follow, like, and share this podcast. Wherever you find it, your support matters and is appreciated. Jill, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing fine as well. I got to warn you, I'm recovering from a cold. I may sound like Barry White from time to time, but other than that, I'm doing great.
Well, you know what? We're in the same boat. I'm the same way. If I
Uh-huh.
suddenly need to grab some orange juice, everybody knows it's for their listening benefit. Trust me.
Fantastic. Hey, look, we are talking about an important topic today. And have you noticed that a lot of people today are talking about trauma? Have you noticed?
Yes, the younger generations have way more of a dialogue about trauma than certainly my
Uh-huh.
generation, Generation X.
Yeah, I tell you, back when I was growing up, we hardly ever talked about it. I'm a boomer. I'm a baby boomer, and I heard about trauma in connection with the Vietnam War in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and didn't do much with it. But the word was at least there.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I didn't have any understanding of trauma, gosh, until
Mhm.
my late 40s. Right there with you.
Uh-huh. Isn't that something? Yeah. Who are your favorites? Do you have any favorites? Let me ask you that way. Any favorite speaker or writer today who talk about trauma?
Oh my gosh. So my two are Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score. That
Yeah.
was the book that explained to me that my physical symptoms of PTSD were
Mhm.
trauma, that my body was communicating the long buried emotions from my childhood. And then
Yeah.
the other author is Gabor, and I'm totally blanking on
Yeah.
his name.
Mate. Yeah.
There you go. He's written a variety. He was the
Mhm.
one who kind of opened my eyes to the idea of generational trauma that
Mhm.
I had already kind of understood. My parents came into their marriage with baggage. I hadn't
Yeah.
really thought about the generational baggage, and he opened my eyes. Those are my two favorites.
Yeah, well, look, you just nailed the two of my favorites. When I first saw the title, "The Body Keeps the Score," I kind of, but my gosh, I think he nailed it, and Gabor Mate for sure. Yeah. So help us understand, and I know that you were a patient of psychedelics, and we'll talk more about that later on. But you've been around trauma, and you've experienced some things. Help us understand what is trauma.
Well, a very layman's terms, because I was an educator, I was never a therapist or a doctor. My definition is trauma is emotions that were never resolved. And so there is no hierarchy of trauma like I thought as a child. I had a kind of a bad childhood, but I was always fed. There was a roof most of the time. There was a roof. And so I didn't really think that I could possibly have trauma because other people had it
Mm.
far worse. That's not the case. Anybody
Yeah.
can have a traumatic event in their lives. And if they don't have a way of handling those emotions, usually with an empathetic witness, a parent, a therapist, a friend to help them navigate those emotions, they can
Mhm.
kind of stay in the body, which is hence the body keeps the score, because very
Yeah.
often if you notice that when you get triggered by something, you might get really angry or really nervous or really scared, and your body reacts. You might get sweaty
Mhm.
palms. my shoulders used to go up to my ears, things of that sort. That's the body remembering those emotions from that unhealed trauma. So I think that's kind of a very accessible way of understanding trauma can happen to anyone and how you can identify that you have it. One of the ways is paying attention to the body.
Yeah, I mean, I like the way you put that, and that it could happen to anyone because, as I said, I thought it was only war-torn areas, soldiers on the battlefield. But you're saying that, look, it could be anybody. Yeah,
And there's no hierarchy. The person who
yeah,
gets bullied can suffer the same exact trauma as someone who gets attacked. Or,
yeah.
I shouldn't say same exact trauma. The physical trauma response can be equal, is really what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I
There's no
get
hierarchy.
you. And that has implications, right? Especially for the way we talk to each other. We may think that just shouting at a child repeatedly is training the child, but from your experience, that could be marking the child with trauma.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
when you are a child, I like to say marinated in abuse and neglect. I mean, children don't have a choice of their caregivers. So that
Yeah,
parent who is yelling or hitting, thinking he or she is doing the right thing,
right.
is really traumatizing that child in a lot of ways if that child's emotions are not properly handled after. I'm not a proponent of hitting children. I'm just saying there's a
Mhm.
lot of factors that go into what actually sticks as trauma. But remember, children are sponges. So even before they're verbal, they're picking up on your energy, they're picking up on what your actions mean to them. And
Yeah,
remember, too, children children are they are the sons of their universe. So
yeah,
anything that happens to them is because of them. So if you are hitting that child because that child did something wrong in your eyes, that
mhm,
child is a very young child is probably interpreting that as I am bad, I am
yeah,
wrong versus I did something wrong. So there's a really
yeah.
clear distinction there.
Yeah, I love the way you put that. In fact, I even love it the way you, on your subtitle, you put in there my childhood trauma to point us back to those things. This has implications for teachers, doesn't it? Especially elementary school teachers, right? Telling a kid that he or she is stupid may not be a good idea.
Absolutely. You always need to delineate. I learned that I was an English teacher when I first started my career, and you always delineate the behavior from the student. Throwing
Yeah,
that pencil was not appropriate. Not you were really dumb to throw that pencil. You see the difference?
yeah,
You're like
yeah,
it's
yeah.
subtle but distinct.
Look, I'm 70 years of age. I'm gonna tell you a childhood story from a classroom teacher.
Oh no.
I was in class and I had written my essay. This is elementary school now. I'm just a child, maybe
Right.
7, 8, whatever years of age. And I must have written a pretty good essay. My teacher told me this. She said, well, your essay has good content, but your handwriting is so bad, I'm not going to put it on the wall with other children's essay. Now, it's all of these decades later, Jill, I remember that statement to me. So I think that was a taste of trauma, right?
Right.
Was a taste
And
of it. Yeah.
yeah, you didn't have another adult turning around saying, that's
Yeah.
okay. Put
Yeah.
it on the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the
Yeah.
fact
So,
that you remember that, my
uh-huh.
therapist likes to say that we are all children wrapped in layers. We don't leave our childhood stuff behind. It comes with us. That was a wonderful.
Isn't isn't that something? Wow. Look, but not only do we talk about trauma, and your title, your book makes it clear,
Yeah.
there's also PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome. Tell us about that.
In a child abuse instance, PTSD can manifest in incredible hypervigilance. My childhood was very disruptive. Food insecurity, housing insecurity, certainly verbal and physical abuse.
Mm,
And so as I became an adult, I became fixated on safety and security. So the hypervigilance throughout my entire adulthood showed as incredible workaholicism,
mm,
uh,
mm,
kind of high anxiety. But my relationship with my partner Carl had absolutely regulated my nervous system. He was a solid rock. And it wasn't until he passed away, about 18 months after he passed away, that I think my nervous system was starting to heal a little bit from the widow's fog, but had never healed all of that childhood trauma. And so suddenly those symptoms that I had kind of had at like a 3 or a 4 throughout my life, they ramped up to a 10 in a pure PTSD
Mm.
uh, physical embodiment. I couldn't sleep. My stomach was upset. I got a very basic email from work that totally just put me over the edge. It was a
Mm.
1 out of 10 in terms of importance, but I spiraled. I was 1,000% sure I was going to lose my house. I was going to lose my job. I was going to be living in my car. And it was completely irrational. And I had months of this thinking before I went back to my therapist. So you can recognize a PTSD episode by your body in some way, shape, or form, evidencing the fear, the anger, whatever. For me, it's, not sleeping, shoulders up here, my stomach upset, palms sweaty, not being able to think clearly. Those are pretty much the signs for a person going through child abuse in
Uh,
adulthood, experiencing kind of all of those physical memories again.
that's a great example. And what I like what you said was that you got a communication at work, and it brought on all of those symptoms. I can imagine someone being at work and having a meltdown or whatever. And that
Yes,
person may be right reacting to something that happened decades ago and may not even know that they're responding to something, not the event, but something that preceded it.
1,000%. Our
Uh,
brains are wired to protect us, and if there's any sort of threat that mirrors what we may have experienced as a child, we will
yeah,
absolutely respond.
yeah, I've seen that. In fact, look, yes, I've seen that in myself.
Right.
Looking back, I've had a blow up. Wait a minute, my response was greater than the actual thing, and maybe there was something else feeding into that. I'll be mature enough to admit that, and I think that's what you're saying. So let
That's
me ask you
beautiful
this, Joe.
self-awareness. Yeah.
I'm sorry, repeat that, please.
That is beautiful self-awareness. A lot of
Mhm.
people don't even touch it. They just kind of accept their behavior. That level of
Yeah.
self-awareness is phenomenal.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I've done a lot of work. And Joe, let me ask you this now. Growing up, let's say you're a teenager in high school doing the teenager thing. Would you have said to someone, I've experienced trauma?
Yes.
Hmm.
Well, let me rephrase. There wasn't anyone to talk to about it. The very few family members I had were incredibly dismissive and allowing of my father's behavior, especially. Um, I had a lot of shame about my childhood. I knew
Hmm.
at a fundamental level, my father beating me when I was a child, my mother attempting suicide multiple times throughout her life, my father when I was a teenager living in a 1 bedroom apartment and sometimes waking up and having my father in my bed. Like I
Hmm.
knew that it was not normal. I didn't know what normal was.
Yeah.
I just knew that what I was dealing with wasn't. Um, but there really wasn't anyone to share it with
Mhm.
because there was really no one that could help. The 1 or 2 times I tried with extended family were flops. So no, I didn't really talk about it.
Yeah. Okay. You just mentioned you just dropped two bombs on me right then. One was your mother.
Sorry.
So we got to talk about this a little bit, and I want to talk about how the knowledge of your mother's death by suicide made you feel. Do you recall how that made you feel at that time?
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me clarify. I'm just so used to this being my life that sometimes I go through things too quickly. I apologize.
Mm.
My mother from my ages 1 through 5 attempted suicide multiple times. The last time that she attempted it was at that age was when I was 5. She tried to kill herself via a shotgun. She survived. My mother actually
Mm.
passed away at 66 from COPD, um,
Okay.
but had actually tried to attempted suicide 2 or 3 times later on in her life, which I kind of
Mm.
attribute to some perimenopause stuff. But what I will tell you is that the shotgun suicide was the most memorable for me because my father and I came home from somewhere and I just wandered up the stairs looking for mommy walked into the bedroom, walked into the bathroom, and saw my mom laying on the bathroom floor. Like I still have that memory. It's a kind memory. It's not full of lots of details, but I still have that memory. And the next memory is me at the neighbor's house watching the ambulance, and just this deep sense of isolation, of alone. Like that was my mommy, and she was leaving me with him. Like even at 5, I was very much aware of that. So I'm sorry. I think you had another part of that question.
Yeah, yeah. I just wanted to get into how you felt. I mean, how you felt. I want people to understand what a child may feel about, seeing any traumatic event. In this case, your mother's attempt to die by suicide.
Well,
And if you finish with that one, the other one was experiencing, beatings from your father in a very. How did the child feel about that? The feeling.
well, what's interesting is that obviously huge self-esteem hits. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, learning to be so codependent on somebody else's emotions,
Yeah.
learning to regulate myself so that I can do the very best I can to not ignite anger in that person. So you kind of lose a sense of who you are. You certainly have a real struggle with anger, because anger was just not tolerated from a woman per se, or a daughter. Um, I think what I'll add on to that is that many of us have a very deep seated, like pre-verbal, I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
Because again, we are the world, we are the sun, the universe goes around us. So anything bad that happens, if we are not soothed, we kind of take that in. And I wasn't good enough. It came out in therapy years later.
Mhm.
I wound up healing. I wasn't good enough. My mommy didn't want to stay away. My mommy wanted to
Yeah.
get away. It took my adult healing to understand that was her last desperate move to get away from my father. Because if the abuse
Mhm.
for me was bad, it was like 100 times worse for her.
Right. Yeah. Look, and I want to play around with this a little more because I really want the audience to get the message that a trauma event, that PTSD,
Mhm.
have legs. I'm gonna throw some words out, and I
Sure.
want you to tell me if it was true for you that what this word suggests shows up. Is it okay with you?
Let's
Sir?
go for it. I'm ready. It's a word
Okay,
game.
all
Ready.
right. Okay, so look, so my point is that it would seem that a traumatic event has wings. It's not just one off, the trauma happened and it's over. So my first word is anxiety. Did any of that show up for you in your life before you healed it?
Absolutely. Do you want a one word? Because the one word is
Well, whatever you want to share with us. Yeah, yeah.
yes, absolutely. The anxiety was, I learned at a very young age that I could not control the universe. I didn't understand that my caretaker was deficient. I just knew the universe, my existence was full of disruption and abuse and hurting. So I carried that anxiety of, what's the universe going to throw at me next? Even though I had a pretty happy adulthood, still in that anxiety of what's going to happen next, because I'm not good enough. The universe is out to get me. It was very much a 2 to 3 year old way of thinking that never got healed until my late 40s.
Yeah, I can imagine that a child, living with traumatic events all around her, in this particular case, may begin to learn that the world is not a safe place for her.
Right. You got it.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, here's my second word, Joe. Depression.
Mm-hmm.
Any of that showed up in your life experience before you healed it?
What was interesting, and I think, you happen to be talking to a woman right now, and I want to validate for a lot of women that uh, I don't know if I was clinically depressed at any point in my life. I will say, with my hormonal fluctuations on a monthly basis, I absolutely experienced it. So I don't 100% know if the trauma made those depression feelings at those times of the month more intense or not. I don't really know. I can't separate that.
Yeah.
But I just want to validate for other women out there who kind of notice mood shifts, that it might be trauma or it literally might just be hormones.
Yeah.
But my symptoms, I was very much aware that my symptoms up until before my partner passed away, my symptoms were nothing compared to my mother. My mother was diagnosed as clinically depressed. So I was very much aware of what that looked like. And I would not have described myself as clinically depressed during, most of my adulthood.
I tell you what, your response reminds me of the resilience of the human spirit, because you must have been, you are a very resilient woman to have gone through what you went through and not immediately say that, yes, I was clinically depressed. I think that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Here's another one. And I want to throw these words out because I really want people to understand that, that people who've gone through something carry signs of these words with them. Anxiety, depression. Here's my third word: guilt. Guilt.
No.
Oh,
No.
that's awesome.
Yeah, no, I would say regret for one decision in my
Uh,
life, but no, not guilt. I've never been a cruel person. I've always erred on the other side of being
uh,
kind. So yeah, no, I can cross that one off the list. I'm
oh,
not,
that's fantastic. Yeah. So you could point and say if that belongs to that person,
yeah.
I'm not responsible for that person's behavior. I think that's cool. I love it. Yeah. Here's my last word: shame.
Oh,
Shame.
now that one's a big one.
Uh,
So one of the best ways that you can tell if somebody has a really traumatic background or is dealing with PTSD is the fact that they don't talk about it. And so what I mean by that is people with whom I worked in the same school district for 20 years. People did not know about my background. I simply did not talk. In fact, I got kind of a reputation for being a little snooty, being a little uppity because I didn't talk. I didn't join in. But the fact was that I didn't have the common childhood experiences that other people did. So I just didn't join the conversation. And I've learned that that's a major, major red flag. If you never talk about something because it's not going to be accepted, people's eye, you're going to get the side eye, you're going to make the room
yeah.
go silent when dropping my mother's suicide, kind of like people give you the side eye, they don't know how to deal with
Mhm.
that. That's a major sign. So I dealt with a ton of shame. It was every single therapeutic journey. There was a big hurdle of, I'm going to have to admit something to my therapist, and I'm
Mhm.
terrified to do so. Shame was huge with
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, that's a heavy load
Yeah.
for a person to carry. Kim, now you've mentioned Carl, your partner, a couple of times. If
Mm-hmm.
you don't mind, and you can refuse, but if you don't mind, can you tell us about him just a little bit about him and with the relationship? I'm just, because you've mentioned that his name a couple of times.
So the relationship with Carl was a relationship that showed me unconditional love, which I hadn't really experienced at a broad scale. I think my parents loved me as much as their trauma allowed. I know for a fact there were lots of times they did not like me, and that's okay. That's all right. But that relationship really showed me, again, I didn't exactly know what a healthy relationship looked like. I just knew that I didn't have one growing up. And yet that relationship with Carl wound up becoming incredibly healthy, incredibly loving and caring. And I think in a lot of ways shaped, just a loving, happy early adulthood, late 20s, 30s, 40s. So I don't know. I want to call it early adulthood.
Mhm.
And losing him really
Yeah,
was it really became the door that closed, and the door that opened became, okay,
yeah.
now you're gonna have to deal with your childhood stuff.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, that's important. And the two things that I get from that is one is, a person can make a difference. And in your particular case, one person who believed in you, who cared about you, who loved you, made a big difference for you. But the second thing, you just said it, and I want to follow that a little bit. You said upon his passing, that forced you to do what?
To do the work.
Uh-huh.
If you've lost a child, if you've lost a significant other, if you lost a parent, a lot of people go through something called a fog. With widows, it's called widow's fog, but it certainly is not just for widows. And
Mhm.
it kind of makes everything a little bit fuzzy. in my mind, the second year after his passing was actually way worse than the first, because a lot of the widow's fog had started to dissipate and I was kind of seeing things and feeling things more clearly. The fog absolutely dampened. And so when this PTSD thing hit, and I say hit because it almost was like, it was just like such a physical reaction to reading this email. I went a couple of months and I knew in my head those things weren't going to happen. I had safety plans. I wasn't going to lose my job. I wasn't losing my job, but I was still having that PTSD reaction. And even after 2 or 3 months of talking to my therapist, because I had gone back, I had started working with a therapist to help me with the grief work, because friends can only listen so much.
Yeah.
And so I treated myself to therapy. And when I went back to her with this new stuff that I couldn't figure out, it was a couple of months in this PTSD reaction, and I was starting to lose hope. So his death, I never would have met my therapist without his passing. I certainly never would have had that PTSD episode if in my life there was someone I felt could kind of hold me up, per se. So, and look, I kind of tear up a little bit.
Yeah.
It was time. The universe was saying it was time to deal with this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the message really for others is, get the help you need. No one has to suffer alone. And, losing someone close to you may leave, I shouldn't say can, may leave a hole in your soul. And sometimes it's time to do something about it. And I wanted to ask about that before I approach the psychedelics.
Sure.
And my question to you, Jill, is what opened that door for you? Because most people are walking around thinking, I'm going to try psychedelics. So what pointed you in the direction of psychedelics broadly and then MDMA specifically?
Actually, it was the specific first. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I fell into this. I was a Generation X kid who saw the egg in the frying pan. I had very little experience with Schedule I drugs. I had only taken ecstasy one other time in my life. And when my therapist said, look, you've got PTSD, go read because I didn't believe her. I was like, have you met me? I'm corporate girl. By that point, I had moved over to Microsoft. I'm like, have you met me? Come on. And she said, go read The Body Keeps the Score. That's what convinced me. I was like, oh, all of this makes sense. And I'm kind of holding my hands around my body, like my body signals finally made sense. And that's when she said to me, look, I'm learning to be a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapist. Go take a look at the research at MAPS.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They were the folks working with the FDA since 2017 in MDMA therapy for PTSD. And approximately I was an English major, so I'm rounding, 2/3 of the people who go through the clinical trial, after 3 therapeutic journeys, they no longer qualify for a PTSD diagnosis. Not all the trauma in their life is healed. They no longer have those PTSD symptoms. And in addition, so remember, I started my career as a teacher. I had many student teachers that I trained. So not only did I get to work with my trusted therapist, but my guide, because usually the protocol is 2 doctors, and I use the word doctor, therapist, guide, facilitator. The protocol is 2 people working with a patient. And so her mentor in her program, like I would be part of her practicum, and her mentor was a medical doctor at the time. So I kind of thought, there's no way this can get safer for me. Emotionally, I had my therapist, and physically, I had a doctor. I kind of felt like the universe just was like, this is where to go. And people are kind of like, well, that was really brave of you. Not really. We're talking like 5 or 6 months since I got that work email, and I wasn't feeling better with the talk therapy. And I was getting more and more suicidal, because what's the point of living if all you're living with is fear? So it wasn't necessarily as brave as people think it was. It was a lot more of, I don't know what else to do.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm going to come back to psychedelics in a moment, but I'm going to roll back because, heck, when I heard about psychedelics and the MDNA. I'm learning that from you. So I don't know anything about it. But my first impression would have been this is what people did to get high. I don't want to
Right,
get high, right?
right,
So yeah.
right.
Um, but you're telling us something different. I'm going to get into it. I'm going to approach it different in a moment. So pardon me to just switch gears
Go for it.
just a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but you've mentioned a couple of things that we need to learn more about, and one is the word journey. You mentioned your first journey. When you said that, what do you mean?
That's it. Thank you very much for that question. Listen to my voice. I'm so sorry.
You're fine.
That's a great question because when the common terminology is that when you are working with psychedelics therapeutically, it's usually called a journey. When you're using psychedelics recreationally, people often use the word trip. So that's how the
Aha.
delineation happens.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you said that because, you mentioned, this is the egg, that's the frying pan, that's your brain. I'm thinking trip, but you're saying therapeutically, it's called a journey.
Right.
The second thing I wanted to ask you, just so people can understand, people like me,
Uh-huh.
when you say MDMA,
Yep.
does that refer to something specific or is it just called MDNA?
Oh my gosh,
And it,
fantastic question. It is unfortunately a word that I cannot pronounce. It's only got like,
okay,
5,000 letters attached to it.
okay.
I'm obviously exaggerating, but MDMA is just an abbreviation. It was a drug that was synthesized in the early 1900s, and it's
Okay.
most commonly thought of on with like the rave culture of ecstasy or Molly. So
Mm,
there's a book out there called like Ecstasy is Medicine. I purposely don't use those street drug names because number one, I didn't
okay.
have a street drug. I had a medical grade MDMA.
Mhm,
And that's the actual term of the medication. It like, as
mhm,
opposed to saying, a painkiller, if I was specifically giving the name of a painkiller. In this instance, I'm
mhm.
specifically giving a name of a psychedelic, MDMA.
Got you. Right. And we're really talking about MDNA therapy. We're
Right,
talking about a therapeutic
yes,
process here and not just taking some drugs and see
right,
what happens. Yeah. So now you mentioned the FDA, and we live in the United States, the
yeah,
Federal Drug Administration, for those of you who may live in other countries. And you're saying that they're conducting clinical trials
right.
or
So
approving clinical trials.
well, let's cross our fingers and do a happy
Okay.
dance. So,
Okay.
uh, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS.org, MAPS.org. That's the organization, the nonprofit that was raising money to hold the clinical trials. Rick
Mhm,
Doblin was able to work with a Schedule One substance because he went to the federal government and said, "We have thousands and thousands and thousands of veterans that are committing suicide. MDMA works for PTSD. Let's start generating some clinical trials so that we can get MDMA rescheduled to work in a therapeutic environment." And so
mhm,
as early as 2017, the FDA looked at the first clinical trial. And I might have my timing mixed up a little bit. I don't
mhm,
exactly know when the FDA was brought in, but this is the way I understand it, that when the FDA looked at the first trial results of, again, 3/4 ish of people, they turned around and labeled MDMA as a breakthrough therapy designation. And for those out there who are interested in investing, that whenever a drug company gets breakthrough designation, that means that the FDA is kind of ready to move as quickly as they can to get a product out to market because there is nothing currently in market that works as well. So I
mhm,
preface that with the MAPS organization with their second and third clinical trials had to work with the FDA. So the FDA has been on board the entire time. And Lycos, now I'm going to make things confusing, to generate the funds needed because clinical trials cost millions of dollars. MAPS needed to kind of break off to Lycos Therapeutic, which is a for-profit organization. And Lycos finished up those clinical trials. And that's the organization that submitted the fast-tracked FDA application. And so why I said earlier, cross your fingers and do a happy dance, which is again from my teaching days, is that FDA approval is anticipated August 11th. I'm using the word anticipated.
August 11th, 2024.
August 11th.
This year.
Like next month. So I'm sorry, this podcast might come out after that ruling. So we're in July right now. So, we're looking at next month. There's quite a bit of PR going on because predictably, whenever you're talking about a psychedelic, there's a little bit of a backlash. We've had two organizations kind of say, we don't know if we trust this therapy. I'm really optimistic. The FDA has been involved in these clinical trials since 2017. I think if they had seen any red flags, they would have pulled, much sooner. So, did I answer all of the questions?
Yeah, you did. And so you did. Yeah. And what you're telling us is that this is a legitimate therapy that may help a lot of people as it helped you, because you're saying, let me ask you the question: are you a witness of the effectiveness of MDNA therapy to heal childhood trauma?
Right. That's exactly why I'm talking to you today, and that's why I'm a voice of advocacy. I was not in a clinical trial. I'm very transparent. My work was underground, and my healing followed the protocol really in a very similar way. I had 3 therapeutic journeys over the course of a year. The clinical trials, because they had to have a time frame, they did it like in 3 months, like every month. My therapist and guide just kind of let me set the pace. I think that's really the main difference. 3rd journey, we added a little bit of psilocybin to the journey. That was a little bit off protocol. But for the most part, like 95% of my experience followed the clinical trial protocol. And so when I came out of that 3rd journey, there was some really profound healing that I remembered. Because usually in journeys, you may or may not remember what kind of happened, the integration, the real work happens after the journey. And I remember saying, if this could work for me and how deeply buried my trauma was, I need to be a voice. I was a corporate girl. Like, I wanted to be the voice for people who wouldn't necessarily pay attention to the person who's wearing too much neon and has a bunch of piercing. No shade to people who wear a bunch of neon and have a bunch of piercings, but corporate Jill would really not pay attention to them. Corporate Jill wanted to have a voice of saying, hey, wait a minute, this really can work. And so that's why, thank you for having me on the podcast. I get to really explain the story.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, I'm convinced that you had a positive experience and you're still, living the benefits of that. But take us deeper. I got to ask you, because many of us haven't tried MDNA before. What's it like using it?
Yeah. So remember, I'm old, so I say kids. Like a 30-year-old is a kid to me at this point. Kids are using it at raves every single weekend. MDMA is not new. This is not anything that hasn't been around. In fact, the fact that it kind of got out of the laboratory is one of the reasons why it became a Schedule I drug, because it kind of makes you very happy. It makes you want to connect with people. You are able to speak on it. You're able to dance on it. You're not incapacitated at a proper dose. And remember, everything is reliant on dose. You wouldn't go take 10 painkillers if the proper dose is 2, the same way you wouldn't take X amount of MDMA if the proper dose is X. So let's all keep that in perspective. And it is just, for a trauma patient, when I first took the MDMA and I'm putting my hands on my shoulders, it calmed my body down. And for the first time, I was able to say to 2 people that I was 100% convinced that if my father was in the room with us at that time, he would have had his hands around my throat. I was living with the fear as an adult that if my father ever really got in my vicinity, he would try to kill me. I never would have been able to have that conversation. My body would have flipped out. Certainly a lot of shame, a lot of embarrassment. Like, my life wasn't normal. But that was me having that conversation about 2 hours into my first therapeutic journey.
Okay. Wow. So does it feel like, and I'm ignorant, so please excuse my question.
You're doing a great job.
Did it feel like a high? after you're using it, was it like, oh, whoa, I'm
Yeah.
intoxicated?
Um, Only when you stand up to run to the bathroom, which I was
Uh,
perimenopausal, so I had to run to the bathroom constantly. Then you're kind of aware that you're in an enhanced state, but it is not like a classic. In fact, some people argue it shouldn't be labeled a psychedelic, and I don't get involved in that. It's not the classic, psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca kind of experience of you're incapacitated per se and you're seeing visions. This is a medicine. Again, people are using it to go to
mm,
dance clubs. You're
mm,
totally within, you have all your faculties. um and we voice recorded. I would say anybody who's doing this work, take the time to set your phone to voice record the entire journey. And when I listened to it, I was as clear speaking then as I am now. There's not even like slurring my words like a margarita.
mm,
The only way that I knew sometimes that I was in an enhanced state is sometimes my eyes got a little blurry, and I definitely felt my heart race. It is a stimulant. MDMA is a stimulant.
mm.
But other than that, and the fact that 5 to 8 hours goes by like that, and you think you were only out for 45 minutes.
Wow. Okay. So what is it like after a journey? You said it's not like it's a medicine, but is it like a hangover? Like, gosh, I really tied one on last night.
That's a really great question. So you can take the same way that alcohol can give you a little bit of a hangover. MDMA
Mm,
certainly can, because you're releasing a whole bunch of feel good chemicals in your brain.
mm,
There are supplements you can take to ease that a bit, but you absolutely should be ready for the day after to make it kind of a lounge around the house, have some
mm,
soup, take it easy. Don't
mm,
run a marathon the day after you do an
mm.
MDMA journey.
Yeah. Okay. So I've in preparation for you, I've come across a few things you've said, and I'm going to call it your discoveries after therapy, or
Yeah,
perhaps even your discoveries during and after therapy. I want to throw some things out, and just wanted to have you underscore them for me. Is it okay with
sure.
you?
Yeah,
Okay. So I heard it as your discoveries. I read it as your discoveries, and if I'm off base, you let me know that as well.
before it.
But one of them is that you discovered that that there is value in your dreams. If that's right, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there's a lot of value in your dreams in that your subconscious is talking to you. And the haziness, I'm actually going to link this to the experience on MDMA and the experience of healing, because the haziness you might have about, hey, I had a really cool dream, or I had a really disturbing dream. And you know how the edges of that dream are kind of a little fuzzy, but you remember the basics of it.
Mm.
I always used to have one before every year when I started teaching that, like, the kids were on the desks, they wouldn't listen to me. And I was like, oh, it's August, I'm getting ready.
Yeah, yeah.
That kind of sensation is very much like the sensation the days, weeks, and even months after an MDMA journey, in that you remember childhood memories that you hadn't thought about in so many years, in kind of that fuzzy way that you might remember a dream. And the same way that you can think about a dream and it's kind of like over here, like, oh, what was that? Is the same way these memories would come up. And because they were kind of over here and my body was still calm, I could look at them from my adult perspective. So, that 230 pound, 6'2" male beating that toddler, that memory of him lording
Mm,
over me, I was able to look at with a little bit of distance, the same way a dream you have a little bit of distance, and realize, hey, wait a minute, I was not at fault there. That toddler didn't deserve that treatment. That adult had some trouble. So I
mm,
think that might be a really great way for people to kind of understand the
mm,
process if they think about their dream state and being able to
mm.
analyze dreams. You ultimately get to analyze and heal trauma memories.
Hmm. Okay. All right. Here's another one. Back in the day, back in the 90s, I believe, there was a lot of talk about the inner child.
Yeah.
Maybe there still is. I'm not aware of it going on the way it used to. But then
Yeah.
you said that you discovered that it's possible, if I got it right, to free your inner child. Can you expound on that for us a little bit?
So there's two ways of thinking about this. So if anyone out there is familiar with internal family systems, Dr. Richard Schwartz has a therapeutic modality that basically says that each of us has different parts in us. And those parts are our subconscious controlling our behavior. If you got really scared about doing something, if you get triggered and you get really scared, Dr. Schwartz's philosophy is there's a part of you that you can identify and talk to and identify why that fear exists. The way that that language evolved for me was different ages for me growing up. So for instance, I used to get like a really, really vicious pain in the back of my neck. When I got that pain and I learned to talk to my body to say, okay, let me just do an inventory. Oh, I got this burning pain in the back of my neck. Body, what are you trying to tell me? Which automatically requires a little bit of imagination. Absolutely does. Body, what are you trying to tell me? And what would happen for me is that I would, after like 2 or 3 minutes, I would 9 times out of 10 get a childhood memory where I experienced that exact same pain. And I learned that if I get a searing neck pain, it goes back to me being 10 after just getting beaten and just feeling so trapped. So it was a feeling of trapped. And so what you can do is you can heal those inner children by using your imagination and looking at that 10-year-old, and as an adult, put yourself in that memory and say, what does that 10-year-old need? That 10-year-old probably needed a hug, and that 10-year-old probably needed to know it was going to be okay. She wasn't alone. So it requires a different way of thinking about therapy. It requires being willing to use your imagination, and it requires being willing to go back to some of those really ugly, nasty memories.
Wow. Whew. I'm learning so much from you. You used another word. I love the word. It's something that people talk about, but with how you use it, just touched me in many ways. And I'm going to connect the word to two other words, okay? But the word that you used was that it's possible to reframe. Reframe is the word.
Yep.
First word I want to connect you to, I want to connect you to one. First one is old memories, that you can reframe your old, let's call them disturbing memories. If I got that right, can you say more for us?
The reframe is the difference of being able to, the difference between this was my childhood, this is how it was, versus looking at your childhood. And I always kind of put my hand out like it's on a television screen or a movie screen, taking a step back from that memory and looking at it from your now adult eyes and realizing that memory was really not the way you interpreted it as a toddler. I mean, we don't really trust anything that toddlers say, right? There's usually a handshake between the kindergarten teacher and the parent. I won't believe what I hear about your class, and if you don't believe what you hear about my household, right? And yet, most of our belief system or the stories we know about life are generated even before we are verbal. And so suddenly being able as an adult to look at those memories from a distance, almost like there were somebody else's memories. If your best friend had just told you that he or she had gotten beaten as a toddler, your response would be, well, that wasn't your fault, that was the parents' fault. But yet trauma patients have a really hard time because, again, we're the center of our universe and we learn everything is about us when we're little kids. That's the way we develop. So the reframe is the way to heal. That's literally the secret to it. It's all it is.
That's so powerful. I mean, I just loved it when when you first opened that door for me.
Yeah.
Another one, you already touched on it, but I want you to bring it here as well, because this is so hopeful. Because, the way I read you was that it's also possible to reframe those disturbing old beliefs. Can you say more about that for me?
I just did a video about this. My last retreat, I started changing my own vocabulary from beliefs to stories. And I know I might I might lose some people with this, but here's where it comes from. I have understood with all of my healing, this is totally hindsight 2020. So if this can help anybody else, I hope it can. That what I believed, that my father would have killed me, the universe was against me, I was 2 steps away from being poor again. Those were actually stories. Those were stories created at different times in my life. And suddenly, when I look at my life as a series of stories that can be rewritten, healing became much faster, because for whatever reason with me, like, it was hard to change a belief, because a belief is kind of like who you are. But suddenly when I shifted it with, wait a minute, this is just a story. I can rewrite the story. Things happened even faster. So
Wow.
again, I know some people might listen to that and be like, "Woo, what is she talking about?" But you know what? Try it. Try it with like 2 beliefs and say, you know what? Is this a story? Is there another story that could replace this? And you'd be surprised.
I love it, actually. I take it. I just received it. I just received it. And here's one that really gets me, because it's like you made a promise. I'm personal. You made a promise to me.
Okay.
You said, and I'm going to use possible here. It's
Okay.
possible for the body to release
Yeah.
stressful emotions that hold you down.
Yes. Yes. I think I would have, again, hindsight 2020. I used to cry in yoga class. Whenever I would get into like pigeon pose or any pose that really worked on the hips, a lot of our trauma, for whatever reason, at least with me, got stored in my hips. And I wouldn't even go to a yoga retreat because I'm like, all I'm going to be doing is crying. And I never kind of figured it out. I think I would have moved a lot faster. This is my theory. I would have moved a lot faster with my healing if I had done more somatic work, because for me, my trauma absolutely was a mental reframe, but it was also a physical memory. Um, and you'll have somatic practitioners out there who will kind of move a client in a certain way, and the client will just break down. And it definitely is your body releasing or feeling that emotion or any variety of things. But there's 1,000% a link between what's going on in your body and your brain. It's kind of a different way of thinking about therapy. For years, we just thought talk therapy was your brain, but in reality, it's a brain body connection. And somatic work. I got back in May from an Iboga retreat. Iboga is the most powerful psychedelic known to man right now. It's from the Iboga bush. And I saw people actively, physically releasing trauma. Their bodies just kind of, jerking, moving around. Like, it's a thing.
Wow. Well, I'll tell you what, Jill, you are surely an inspiration. So some people would have kept it a secret, but you put it into a book. What prompted you to write this book, documenting your experience?
The fact that my mother never got help. So my mother was clinically depressed her whole life, and was on a variety of medications. And in the latter part of her life, she self-medicated with marijuana. She was just desperate to calm down the voices. And here, and that led me where in reality, I probably should have been in therapy as an adult. I didn't see any faith in it. I saw what my mother went through and the lack of results, and I had zero trust. I'm telling you, when I went to that therapist after Carl's passing, it was literally just in my mind so I could pay someone so that I could feel the grief, that I could take up somebody's time and feel the grief. I didn't have a lot of faith in it. I needed another person that I could share that stuff with. When I saw, number one, after the first journey, I saw that it worked, which is what kept me going back. But at the end of the third journey, there was just such profound healing. And the book only covers journeys 1 through 3 when I no longer qualified for PTSD diagnosis. Psychedelics kind of make you want to give back to the world. They absolutely do. So you don't make any major life changes the first month after you do a psychedelic journey. But I took my English degree. I was an English teacher back in the day. I said, I really want to let people know that this healing modality can work. If this had been around, it is absolutely criminal that this particular substance was a Schedule 1 substance, because if my mother would have had access to this therapy in her 20s and 30s, her life could have been radically different.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why
Yeah.
people need to know that it can work.
Yeah.
People also need to know it's not turnkey. You're
Uh-huh.
going to hear a lot of marketing claims that it's, 10 years of therapy in 5 hours. And in a lot of ways it is. And you have to put the work in later. You
Mm-hmm.
have to be willing to meditate or walk or deal with those emotions, or when you get triggered, really kind of think it through. It's not
Mm-hmm.
turnkey, but if talk therapy is like the horse and buggy on the little country road, MDMA is the zippy car on the superhighway.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Love that analogy. And your book title advertises, and I think this it's one thing to talk about trauma, and it actually could be frustrating sometimes to me, just to hear people talk about trauma. The trauma, this, that trauma type, whatever. But you say it's possible to heal it because you said you healed your trauma, and that's what I find so inspiring about your work. Is this also an audiobook or is it only in print form?
No, it's an audiobook. It's me singing in my closet. I apologize to everybody who gets the audiobook. You get to listen to me
Uh,
for a few hours.
oh, I'm sure that's terrific. Wow. And I think you also have a companion workbook with this as well.
Yes. So
Uh-huh.
I did two more journeys. I like to say that the three journeys healed the capital T traumas. I was no longer
Okay.
suicidal. I saw that there was a future. And I had been marinated in trauma and abuse for, the first 18, 19 years of my life. And so there was still work to do. I did two more subsequent journeys over the following year and a half with my doctor and therapist.
Mhm.
They wound up moving out of the area. And I started to get very curious about how different psychedelics work with trauma. So I've been doing psychedelic tourism. And my very first psychedelic tourism retreat, I saw people get very disappointed that they didn't understand the prep needed. They didn't understand intentions. They thought it was turnkey. I'll just suddenly get an answer just by sitting with some mushrooms for a couple of hours. And
Yeah.
sometimes you can, but usually you have to put some work in. And so I basically cheated the strategies
Mm.
that my therapist and I used to prepare me for every one of my journeys. I put into a workbook. I got to put my teacher hat back on, and I created a workbook.
Uh-huh. That's awesome, Joe. I'm so glad. Obviously, I'm sorry that you went through what you went through as a child, but the universe has touched you with a bit of grace,
Yes.
and you were bold enough to be in the world sharing and teaching. I'm so glad that you're doing it. So thank you so much for being with me today. But let me ask before you go, is there anything else that we haven't touched upon that you want to put into the record before we say goodbye?
I would say the teacher in me made the YouTube channel as kind of a little bit of a curriculum. So if
Mm.
you have PTSD symptoms, or you know somebody and you want to understand this therapy from a patient's perspective, go check out the Journey Sage on YouTube. And I will also say, too, that there are a lot of clinical trials going on. LSD just got FDA breakthrough designation. So check out Johns Hopkins for psilocybin and depression. Check out LSD. I think it was LSD might have been for PTSD or anxiety. Don't quote me. I'm not exactly sure. I
Okay.
should know that.
Uh,
My point being, there's a lot of clinical trials out there. And so if any part of this conversation was interesting, but you don't have that particular diagnosis, still do some research, because there's been millions of dollars poured into research, and it's only going to continue. So there could be a solution for folks.
mm. Yeah, Jill, I tell you what, you are certainly an educator and an inspiration.
Oh,
Thank you again for sitting with me today.
oh my gosh, this was a lovely conversation. Thank you for having me, Stephen. I appreciate it.
Okay. Well, you've been listening to the Possibility Action Network podcast. Our guest today has been Jill Sitnick, the author of Rescuing Jill. I'm your host, Stephen Middleton. Until next time, good day